Las Vegas. Backstage. Late enough that the applause hasn't fully died, only thinned into echoes that cling to the walls. Someone laughs at a joke that lands too cleanly. Too precise. It isn't about Dean Martin. That's what makes it dangerous. It's about his son. The room is full of men who don't apologize. And a few whose silence is usually enough to make others choose their words carefully. Dean doesn't react. No tightening of the jaw. No warning glance. No shift in posture. He smiles, the way people expect him to. Changes the subject. Lets the moment pass. A couple of faces register relief. Others mistake it for weakness. Someone even thinks the line got away with it. But something in the air doesn't return to normal. Because the men who understand power don't watch for anger. They watch for decisions. And in that exact second, quiet, almost polite, it becomes clear that a line has been crossed. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Whatever comes next won't be loud. It won't be violent. And it won't happen where anyone can point to it. But somewhere beyond this room, beyond tonight, the joke has already started costing more than it earned. Dean Martin won't raise his voice. He won't need to. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. Las Vegas had a way of swallowing noise whole. The applause from the showroom still lingered in the corridors, a low aftertaste of clapping hands and cigarette smoke, but backstage the air tightened. Jackets hung loose on hooks. Ice melted untouched in glasses. Someone laughed too loudly, then stopped. The joke landed there. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't framed like a threat. It slid in sideways, dressed as familiarity, delivered by a man whose name people never said twice in the same sentence. He leaned in just enough, voice smooth, amused, and mentioned Dean's son as if the boy were a punchline everyone shared. A Mafia quip, soft, clever, deniable. The kind that let the speaker smile afterward and claim innocence if challenged. For half a second, nothing moved. Dean Martin stood with his jacket open, tie loosened, the stage still clinging to him. He smiled. Not the wide one from under the lights, but a smaller version, almost polite. He didn't ask for clarification. He didn't stiffen. He didn't even let the silence stretch long enough to feel deliberate. He shifted the conversation, commented on the sound in the room, reached for a glass he didn't drink from. Around them, people read it wrong. Some saw indifference. Others saw the familiar caricature, the crooner who floated through life, half amused, half buzzed, never serious enough to take offense. A few exchanged looks that said, "That's it." In a town built on posturing, silence was often mistaken for retreat. But the quiet had weight. Dean had rules, though he never announced them. The stage belonged to the crowd. The jokes belonged to the room. His family belonged nowhere near either. He never brought his children into dressing rooms, never paraded them backstage, never used them as proof of anything. They were not extensions of the act. They were not currency. That was why the joke mattered. Not because it hinted at danger, but because it assumed access. It crossed a line without acknowledging it existed. And Dean noticed lines the way some men notice exits. He laughed lightly at something else someone said, placed a hand on a shoulder, and kept his voice even. The moment passed. Or seemed to. Only after the man had drifted away did the room exhale. Someone cracked a nervous aside. Another poured a fresh drink. The night tried to reset itself. Dean didn't follow. Later, when the corridor emptied and the noise finally died, a few who had been there would replay it in their minds. The pause. The smile that never reached his eyes. The way he changed the subject without breaking rhythm. They would understand, eventually, that no anger had been shown because none had been required. Anger announces itself. Boundaries don't. And in that narrow space backstage, between applause and exit, between laughter and consequence, something had already been decided. Not loudly. Not publicly. Just firmly enough that the silence afterward felt different, heavier than before, as if the walls themselves had learned where not to lean. A few days later, the desert road stretched flat and pale under the windshield, Las Vegas shrinking in the mirror like a place already finished with its business. Dean drove himself. He preferred it that way when decisions needed air around them. No entourage. No conversation to interrupt the rhythm of thought. He had learned early that problems didn't announce their true shape. They arrived disguised, wrapped in jokes, favors, casual remarks made to test how much space a man would surrender without protest. He'd seen what happened when those moments were ignored. He'd also seen what happened when they were answered the wrong way. Loud responses felt satisfying, but they invited witnesses, rumors, escalation. Noise created options for other people. Dean didn't give people options. There was a line he never explained, only enforced. On stage, he was flexible. He let things slide. He let people believe whatever version of him made their evenings easier. Off stage, especially where family was concerned, the rules hardened. Years earlier, a careless remark had turned into a logistical nightmare: missed shows, sudden security concerns, unnecessary phone calls meant to sound friendly. He'd fixed it quietly then. He knew how. That afternoon, he didn't dial anyone who advertised power. No shadowy intermediaries. No theatrical warnings. He reached instead for numbers he actually trusted, men who owned venues, booked seasons, controlled calendars and payrolls. People whose influence didn't look dramatic but moved faster than fear. The conversations were brief. He didn't mention the joke. Didn't name the offense. He spoke in practical terms, about discomfort, about standards, about not wanting complications attached to future dates. His tone never shifted. He asked nothing directly. He simply made his position clear enough that no one needed clarification. By the end of the week, the ripple had spread. A scheduled appearance quietly disappeared from a lineup. A charity event found a conflict. A late-night booking stopped returning calls. The man at the center of it noticed only the symptoms, not the cause. That was intentional. In that era, careers weren't always destroyed with headlines. Sometimes they were thinned out, opportunity by opportunity, until the air ran out. People whispered, as they always did. Some assumed mob politics. Others guessed ego. A few understood the truth and kept it to themselves. This wasn't punishment. It was insulation. Dean never followed up. Never checked to see how far the isolation went. He didn't need confirmation. In his world, if the phone stopped ringing, the message had arrived. Driving back toward the city, he felt no triumph. Just a tightening release, like setting something back in place. Violence would have been simpler to explain. This required patience, reputation, and restraint, currencies earned slowly and spent once. When he stepped onto the stage again days later, nothing had changed. Same jokes. Same relaxed posture. Same easy warmth. The audience saw continuity. What they didn't see was the absence forming elsewhere, an empty space where a name had been expected, a presence quietly removed. Dean had no interest in making examples. He preferred erasing the need for them. What they didn't see was the absence forming elsewhere, an empty space where a name had been expected, a presence quietly removed. Dean had no interest in making examples. He preferred erasing the need for them. And somewhere in that widening silence, the boundary held. By the end of the decade, movement had become routine again. Hotels blurred together. Dressing rooms changed, but the habits stayed fixed. Dean learned the shape of every hallway without looking, the distance from door to chair, the way a room sounded before anyone spoke. Control lived in those details. The question came from his son on a quiet afternoon, not framed like an accusation. They were sitting side by side, no audience, no schedule pressing in. The boy had grown enough to sense when adults edited themselves. He'd heard a version of the story, pieces of it, distorted by timing and omission. Names weren't used. Motives weren't clear. But the outline was there. Dean didn't correct him. He listened, nodding once, then said only this: some things don't need an answer. They need an ending. It wasn't advice. It wasn't a warning. It was a statement of fact. The boy didn't ask again. Years later, he would remember the absence of explanation more clearly than any speech could have given him. That was the point. Not long after, the past tried to reintroduce itself. The message didn't come directly. It never did. A mutual acquaintance mentioned that someone was looking to clear the air. Another hinted at regret, framed carefully so it wouldn't sound like responsibility. There was talk of misunderstanding, of jokes taken the wrong way, of wanting to move forward. The language was cautious, almost respectful. Dean waited. When he finally agreed to meet, he chose the conditions. Neutral place. Limited time. No audience. He arrived early, sat where he could see the entrance, ordered nothing. When the man appeared, thinner now, less certain, the contrast did the talking. There were no raised voices. No threats. Dean didn't revisit the past or demand acknowledgement. He listened, hands folded, eyes steady. When it was his turn, he spoke briefly. Not about consequences. Not about forgiveness. He stated what would and would not exist going forward. Family was not material. Not humor. Not leverage. That was all. The meeting ended without ceremony. No handshake. No hostility. Just finality. From that point on, the subject disappeared. Not only from conversations, but from suggestion itself. No one tested the edge again. Not because they feared retaliation, but because the rule had proven permanent. On stage, Dean remained what the crowd expected. Warm. Loose. Effortless. Off stage, something heavier settled in. Not satisfaction. Not relief. A quieter awareness that every boundary, once enforced, stayed enforced by memory. By distance. By the cost no one talked about. He didn't discuss the meeting. Didn't share the decision. Even with those closest to him, the subject remained untouched. Protection, to him, was effective only when it left no story behind. The tours continued. The nights filled. But underneath the movement, something had closed, cleanly, deliberately. Peace achieved without spectacle, paid for in silence. By the early 70s, the version of Dean Martin most people recognized had fully settled in. Television loved him that way, loose tie, glass always nearby, timing just a fraction behind the beat as if he were amused by his own delay. The laugh tracks came easy. Viewers felt like they were in on something casual, unguarded. The illusion worked because it asked nothing from them. Behind the curtain, the rhythm changed. Before tapings, Dean sat alone more often than not. He didn't rehearse lines aloud. He marked beats with his finger against the arm of a chair, counting pauses rather than words. When a drink appeared, it stayed untouched until the work was done. Crew members noticed, though they rarely mentioned it. The man everyone thought was drifting was, in fact, tracking everything: angles, timing, exits. He treated the image the way a craftsman treats a tool. Between shows, on planes and in narrow hotel rooms, the mask stayed close. Lightness without carelessness. Humor without invitation. People felt welcome, but never close enough to lean. That distance wasn't accidental. It had been calibrated over years, reinforced by experience. Those who mistook accessibility for permission didn't last long in his orbit. A pianist who had worked with him on and off once mentioned it, almost by accident, during a late-night conversation. He said Dean never laughed when jokes drifted toward wives or kids. Not disapproval, absence. As if the sound simply didn't register. The room would correct itself without prompting. No one needed reminding twice. That story traveled quietly. Those who remembered the earlier incident understood something then. What had looked like a one-time response wasn't situational. It was policy. The smile, the shrug, the indulgent tone, none of it contradicted the rules. It enforced them by keeping conflict from ever forming a shape. On stage, Dean leaned into the role harder. He let himself seem slower, softer, amused by the chaos around him. He took the fall for jokes written by others. He let people believe he wasn't paying attention. That belief did more work than confrontation ever could. The strength of it was cumulative. Years passed without incident, not because temptation disappeared, but because memory lingered. People remembered what happened when lines blurred. They remembered how nothing dramatic followed, just absence, exclusion, quiet recalibration. The industry learned faster than it talked. Dean never explained the distinction between the man and the act. He didn't need to. The ones who mattered saw the seams. They noticed the way he paused before stepping on stage, eyes closed, breath steady. They noticed how he listened more than he spoke once the lights were off. Control didn't announce itself. It lived in restraint, in preparation, in knowing when not to respond. And the longer the illusion held, the fewer tests came. The armor worked not because it was hard, but because it looked soft enough to underestimate. By the end of the 70s, the world around Dean had learned to move more carefully. Not cautiously, carefully. There was a difference. Care implied awareness without panic, an understanding of limits without needing them restated. For a long time, that had been enough. Then a familiar pattern resurfaced, altered just enough to feel new. The information reached him indirectly, as these things always did. A comment passed through two conversations before it arrived. A tone shift in someone else's voice. Nothing concrete. Just the suggestion that an old circle was circling again, testing the edge of relevance with implication instead of humor. No name spoken. No jokes this time. Only hints, placed where they could be denied if repeated. Dean didn't ask questions. He recognized the method immediately, not an attack, but a probe. The kind meant to see whether memory still held, whether distance had softened resolve. Years earlier, this might have prompted meetings, explanations, visible responses. Now, he understood something better: conflict only existed if both sides agreed to host it. So he declined. Not verbally. Not dramatically. Access simply narrowed. Invitations stopped arriving. Shared spaces became unavailable. People who might have served as bridges found themselves redirected elsewhere. Doors didn't slam, they closed quietly and stayed that way. From the outside, nothing happened. Inside, something shifted. This time, the silence carried weight for him as well. The effort of maintaining that kind of distance, of constantly choosing restraint over reaction, had accumulated. It didn't show in public. On stage, the timing was still perfect. The smile still landed where it always had. But at home, evenings stretched longer. Conversations grew shorter. Protection had become habitual, and habit, even when effective, extracts a toll. For the first time, Dean felt the cost clearly. Not regret. Not doubt. Fatigue. He had succeeded in what he set out to do. The line was no longer questioned. The orbit around him was clean, predictable. But the very mechanisms that kept his family untouched also kept much else at bay. Fewer surprises. Fewer risks. Fewer connections that didn't serve a purpose. He didn't complain. He never framed it as sacrifice. He understood the trade. Still, there were moments, late, quiet ones, when the house felt larger than it needed to be. The rumors faded on their own. Without resistance to push against, they dissolved. The person behind them vanished from relevance entirely this time, not with a stumble, but with a gradual thinning until there was nothing left to notice. The industry adjusted and moved on, as it always did. Dean watched none of it. He focused instead on the routine that remained. The small rituals that didn't ask for explanation. Coffee poured the same way. Music played low. Control, once again, took the shape of absence. The conflict hadn't been won. It had been removed. And that, he knew, was the most final outcome possible, even if it left him standing alone in the quiet afterward, holding a peace that had cost more than anyone would ever see. The early 80s arrived without announcement. No headlines marked the shift, no declarations followed it. Dean simply began to appear less. A cancelled appearance here, a declined invitation there. To the public, it looked like fatigue settling in naturally, the slow easing of a man who had already given enough. No one pressed for reasons. He had earned that courtesy. At home, days stretched differently. Morning light moved across familiar rooms without interruption. Phones rang less often, and when they did, he let them finish on their own. He took short drives with no destination in mind, stopping when the road suggested it. There was no urgency left to manage, no territory to secure. The boundaries he had drawn years earlier held without maintenance now. That, in itself, felt strange. Once, he had controlled rooms by presence alone. Now, control took another form, the ability to leave things untouched. There was no farewell tour. No reflective interviews. Dean avoided the language of closure. He had seen too many men turn endings into performances, mistaking explanation for meaning. What mattered to him had already been handled. Anything beyond that would only invite reinterpretation. The scale of life changed. Instead of audiences, there were afternoons measured by routine. Instead of conflict, stillness. He wasn't lonely in the dramatic sense, there was no ache, no searching, but the quiet had depth. It accumulated. It pressed gently but consistently, like time itself. He never revisited old decisions aloud. Not with friends. Not with family. Especially not with his children. They didn't need to know the mechanics of protection, only its result. He believed that explaining too much weakened the thing being explained. Silence, once again, did the work. Occasionally, something from the past surfaced, a name mentioned casually, a reference stripped of context. It passed without reaction. The stories no longer had edges. Whatever power they once carried had been neutralized by distance and time. Dean noticed something else then, how little energy it took to maintain peace once it was established properly. The effort had been front-loaded. The consequences had unfolded gradually. Now, the quiet simply existed. There were moments, alone at night, when memory brushed close. Not regret, never that, but awareness. He understood that silence leaves traces, even when chosen. It shapes relationships, simplifies landscapes, reduces noise until only essentials remain. He accepted that. Strength, he had learned, wasn't proven by persistence. It was proven by knowing when to stop. When to step back without collapsing the structure you'd built. When to let the world continue without your supervision. By then, the man who once filled rooms no longer needed them. He had exchanged scale for precision, attention for calm. Nothing had been lost. Something had been completed. And the quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was finished. Years later, the story surfaced without names. It happened the way these things always did, half-remembered, softened by time, stripped of sharp edges. Someone recalled a moment backstage long ago, a joke that didn't land, a silence that followed. The details were wrong. The setting shifted. The people blurred together. What remained intact was the pause. The sense that something irreversible had occurred without anyone raising their voice. Those who told it never framed it as a confrontation. They spoke instead about what came after. How a presence faded. How an invitation stopped arriving. How certain doors, once assumed permanent, quietly refused to open again. No explosion. No reckoning. Just a recalibration that everyone felt but no one announced. Dean's name, when it came up at all, was handled carefully. Often it didn't. Sometimes it appeared as an afterthought, followed by a pause that carried more meaning than the words themselves. People understood that saying it too loudly missed the point. What lingered wasn't fear. It wasn't even respect in the traditional sense. It was clarity. He hadn't won anything. There was no victory to point to, no story of dominance to retell. What he had done was simpler and harder to undo. He had defined a limit and made it permanent. Not through force. Not through spectacle. Through consistency. Through restraint that never needed reinforcement. The industry moved on, as it always does. Louder figures arrived. Bigger personalities filled the space. Arguments played out in public, loudly and repeatedly, until they burned themselves out. Those names were easier to remember for a while. But when conversations turned quieter, when someone wondered aloud how certain boundaries seemed to hold without explanation, the memory returned. Not of a threat. Of a man who chose not to react when reaction was expected. That absence became the lesson. Dean never corrected the record. He never shaped the narrative. He left no version of events behind that could be quoted or disputed. What survived did so because it had no competing explanation. Silence gave it durability. In the end, there was no moral drawn, no summary offered. Only an understanding shared by those who had been close enough to notice. Some people never need to raise their voice because the room adjusts before they do. That was the space he left behind. Not empty. Not occupied. Just clearly defined. And long after the noise faded, long after louder men were forgotten, that space remained untouched, quiet proof that the strongest moments are sometimes the ones where nothing appears to happen at all.